thank you for being here with us. I really apologize for the agenda gymnastics that we happen to do due to some difficulties in our IT systems, which amongst others meant that it was disappearing our invite for a while. So we're really pleased to see you all here. We will record this session so that also colleagues that are out of the time zones and convenient time zones right now can listen to it, and hopefully in many languages as well. So I want to appreciate that many national societies are present from all over the Europe region, and I think I also saw some from Canada and probably a little bit further afar, as well as many colleagues from the IFRC, the International Federation of Red Cross and Crescent Societies. So welcome again, and I just wanted to start out by saying that Europe is experiencing an alarming increase in climate crisis and also in what one can call unprecedented convergence of crisis. And in light of the increase in the pace, but also in the interconnectedness of these challenges we face. So can you please mute yourselves when you're not speaking, please? I can hear a lot of you. Yeah, thank you. So just in the light of the increase in the pace and the interconnectedness of the challenges that we're facing, we urgently need to reimagine our way of working. And this meeting is part of, like, how do we reimagine ourselves? We find that our approach has to be shaped by the nature of existing and emerging crises in and across our regions. So with that, the IFRC Europe Office and Europe region is seeking to support Europe and Central Asian national societies, many of you being here. And to do that, we have created what we have called a think, but also a do tank, to deepen our understanding of the nature of the polycrisis and to strengthen our collective capacities, our tools and our systems of sense making from the signals that we can all observe of crisis from the ground level and up. So making use of our localized presence in context to be better at thinking not only in siloed ways, but in a connected way, and use some of the latest tools and approaches that are being developed. So today's speaker is one of those who I think is really providing a lot of support in helping us doing that. So I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. Thomas Homer Dixon, who is the founder and executive director of the Cascade Institute, and also the first one that were publishing a report that really grabbed my attention to say, what is this? This is actually trying to connect all the dots in a new way, and I thought that was highly inspirational and therefore someone who is pioneering research and focusing on global security threats in the 21st century, but also looking at climate change, economic instability, and energy scarcity, things that we've seen falling over Europe and the Europe region over the latest months and years, but also challenge the way we're working and the way that we need to be thinking new and more strategically about the way that the IFRC network, the national societies, are working. So with that, Thomas, also called Tad in the chat, because I think that's how you name yourself. Really happy to have you here, and I want to make a particular announcement that one of your former students is also here. She's our head of delegation in Turkey, waving there. So she was really excited to hear you, but just that your university can lead to many different paths, but also to the IFRC. So just wanted to mention that as well. Over to you, Tad. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Brigitte. Well, it's marvelous to have the opportunity to speak to you all today. and introduce you to this developing notion of the polycrisis. I'm speaking from British Columbia on the west coast of Canada. So the sun is just about to rise over the horizon to the east here. And I think for many of you in Europe and perhaps even as far as Central Asia, the sun has just descended over the western horizon. And when I do these long distance presentations of the kind I'm doing today, where we're speaking to each other from almost opposite sides of the planet, I'm reminded that we are ultimately all 8.3 billion of us on this planet living under the same sun. And that sun crosses over all of our heads every day and brings us together as one common community on this planet, something that I think we often forget and overlook with all the manifold divisions among us, and the issues of the day distract us from the fact that we are all on this very small planet together, living under the same sun. So it's marvelous to have a chance to speak to you today. I'm joined by a couple of my colleagues in the Cascade Institute, Megan Shipman and Michael Lawrence, who are members of our Polycrisis team. Together, we have developed the ideas that I'm going to present today. I'm going to start by bringing up my slides, and I'd be delighted to answer questions and talk about the specifics after my presentation. Now, could I just get confirmation that everybody can see these slides properly? Yes, good. So today I'm going to unpack or explain the concept of the polycrisis as we understand it within the Cascade Institute. The Cascade Institute is also a think, do tank. We are an institute that focuses on taking the best science from the field of complexity science to apply it to solution to the most urgent problems humanity faces. We are an applied science institute. And in the context of this work, we've tried to understand better the convergence of stresses and crises that humankind is facing right now under this general label of the polycrisis. Now, the issue of resilience in humanitarian action that you see in the title here is really, that's an issue in which you are experts. And I'm looking forward very much to hearing your comments and ideas about how one can be, or societies can be, resilient with humanitarian action in the context of the polycrisis. But my presentation today is really going to focus on developing a better understanding of this idea of the polycrisis. The central question we are asking in our work is one that I think many of us ask nowadays, which is, why are so many things going wrong in the world at the same time? This sense that we are being hit by multiple shocks or problems simultaneously, often highly unpredictable, often simultaneous, and the sense that we are increasingly overwhelmed by the challenges we face, whether it's in our personal lives or our professional circumstances. When you look back over what the world has experienced in the last 6 to 8 years, it's really an extraordinary confluence of crises. Wildfires all over the planet, in the northern and southern hemispheres. This is a photograph of wildfires in British Columbia, my home province in Canada. But these are experiences, of course, that many people are witnessing around the world now. The development of a zoonotic viral disease, the COVID-19 pandemic, which had enormous impacts on humanity that we all know. The increase in geopolitical conflict and major warfare, most obviously within Europe, Eastern Europe sphere, in the Russia-Ukraine war, but also now, of course, in the Middle East. And there's been an uptick or a rise in violence, both domestic and international conflict around the world. Extraordinary climate events that have affected whole societies. Here in Pakistan, almost a third of Pakistan was inundated in the summer of 22. Ongoing, again, geopolitical conflicts had significant impacts on supply chains, with, for instance, the slowing of shipments in the Red Sea over the past 18 months. Some of the largest migrations that humankind has ever seen. According to the United Nations, more people are on the move now around the planet as refugees and migrants than ever before in human history, outside of the periods of major war in the 20th century. The rise of populist authoritarian movements around the world, and we're seeing this all over the planet, but notably in Europe, for instance, in Germany with the most recent elections. And again, extraordinary climate events that are producing enormous damage in Europe and beyond. So we can refer to this as a global polycrisis. And this is a term that has become widely used in policy circles and among what we would call the commentariat, the elite of opinion writers and commentators in leading newspapers and journals around the world. But what does it really mean? There are two possible interpretations. One is that it's just a coincidence, that all of these things that are happening are just a coincidence. And if we wait long enough, this coincidence will wane, or it'll go away, and things will return to some kind of normalcy. Or the other possibility, which is the one that we are investigating at the Cascade Institute, is that there are deep causal connections between these various crises, and that there is some kind of what we would call synchronization effect, that the simultaneity, the simultaneous occurrence of these crises is not just a coincidence. It's actually a larger phenomenon because of the connections between the individual crises. And in our definition, we try to capture this idea, our definition of a polycrisis. We try to capture this idea of, first of all, causal entanglement, or the causal connections between the various crises that I've identified before. And the fact that in some sense, the whole is more than the sum of the parts. In other words, that the interactions between these constituent crises, between these individual crises, are producing damage and harms to societies and human beings around the world that are much larger and much different from what would occur if we simply added up the impacts of the individual crises. So there's something, in a sense, new happening with the interaction and the entanglement of all of these crises. It's a problem in and of itself, not just because of the individual crises, but because of the entanglement of all the crises together in a complete phenomenon, a whole phenomenon. So if there's something going on in terms of the causal connections between these crises to create something that we're calling a polycrisis, how do we make sense of the underlying causation, the underlying connections between these things? And this is really the central question we've been asking within the Cascade Institute. There have been people who've tried to identify these connections, most notably Adam Tooze, who is a renowned economic historian at Columbia University. Early on in the Russia-Ukraine war, he noticed, as many people did, that there seemed to be a confluence of things happening, that it was not just the war, there were also the effects in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic, of course, in 2020 and 2021 was still going on, and it was still having effects around the world. And then also climate change impacts were evident around the world. And you can see that in this particular back of the envelope diagram that he put together and he posted on his Substack blog, he's trying to relate all of these different things together. He's trying to show the connections between these things with potential future consequences in terms of hunger crisis and a climate crisis and a Eurozone sovereign debt crisis that could unfold as a result of the interaction of the war, the climate problem, and the pandemic impacts. Now, this diagram was not intended to be definitive, and it was not intended to be scientifically precise, of course. It's nonetheless revealing in an interesting way, but it's also confusing in some ways because it looks like time should be progressing from left to right. But then when you look at it carefully, there's some arrows that go in the other direction, from right to left. So it's a combination of really of two kinds of diagrams. A diagram that we would call a domino diagram, like dominoes falling over, where the time progresses from left to right, and you can see sort of the cascading effects of change as you move from the left-hand side of the diagram to the right-hand side of the diagram. And then there's another kind of diagram that is sort of embedded here, which we would call a loop diagram, where you're seeing feedback loops of various kinds that potentially can produce vicious cycles, self-reinforcing cycles that can make problems much worse. And in a way, Adam Tooze has inadvertently combined both of these types of diagrams in one diagram here, and that I think makes it less easy to understand. There have been other attempts to look at and identify the connections between the various challenges humanity is facing. Probably the most significant long-term effort has been undertaken by the World Economic Forum with their annual global risk reports. Early on in our work on the Polycrisis, Mike Lawrence, as a member of our team, went back and reviewed all of the global risk reports back to 2006 and looked at the evolution of their way of thinking about the interactions between humanity's crises. And here's an example of a diagram they produced in 2007. You can see around the outside of the diagram a whole series of problems that humanity is facing. What the World Economic Forum did was they went out to experts around the world. This was an exercise in what's called expert elicitation. And they asked them basically, what are the major problems you see and which of these problems are related to each other? And the thickness of the lines indicate the strength of the correlations between the problems as indicated by those experts. But really, when you look at this, if you're somebody who's trying to figure out what to do in the field, or if you're a policymaker, it looks like just a whole bunch of bad stuff is happening simultaneously. It doesn't really tell you very much about what to do. It doesn't give you much, as I would say, analytical purchase to allow us to see the underlying nature of the problems better and the underlying nature of the connections. Just a lot of bad stuff is happening at the same time. Flash forward to 2022, the World Economic Forum has gotten better at presenting information in more elegant and perhaps graphically intriguing ways. But ultimately, this diagram doesn't help us understand things much better than the previous one did. Again, a bunch of stuff is connected together in very complex ways, but what does it really mean? Now, to be fair, the World Economic Forum has had periods of time when it has done a better job of really revealing the underlying architecture of the connections between these various challenges, what might be called global systemic risks. And especially during the mid-teens, and then more recently in the last couple of years, they've started to surface or reveal some of the underlying causal loops, those vicious cycles I referred to earlier. But for the most part, they've been producing analysis that looks a bit like this, and we would argue is not terribly helpful. So in our work, we have tried to provide a framework for understanding what's going on inside the polycrisis, the underlying causal connections. And this framework was published early this year in January 2024 in the Cambridge Journal Global Sustainability, with this article titled Global Polycrisis, the Causal Mechanisms of Crisis Entanglement. And underlying this framework is a very simple model that we call the STC model, as in stress, trigger, and crisis. We identify these three separate and distinct components of the polycrisis. If we're looking at one system, such as the economy or the climate or geopolitical system, say at the global level, we can identify a distinction between stresses that are affecting that system and triggers that would trigger a crisis. So stresses are slow processes. They often manifest themselves at the global level, certainly at a continental level. So they cross or extend across large geographic areas. They're slow, they're macro phenomena, they are large geographic, they have large geographic scale.
5 p.m.
I think we have somebody who's got their mic open. You could mute yourself, that would be great. So stresses, again, are slow processes. They manifest themselves often globally, and they are, we would say, data rich. In other words, we know a lot about these stresses. We often have a lot of data indicating their trajectory over time. And so they're relatively predictable into the future in terms of where they're going. So you think of rates of economic growth, changes in demography and population growth, the warming of the climate, widening gaps between rich people and poor people, wealth gaps within societies and between societies. These are things that we can we know about, we can track over long periods of time and predict, at least to a certain extent, into the future. Triggers, on the other hand, are more local and they're much faster. Think of something like an assassination or the bankruptcy of a major firm or a wildfire or a major storm. These are what you would call stochastic processes or events. They are relatively unpredictable and they happen in specific localities geographically, and they're fast. They unfold over a period of seconds to maybe at most a few weeks. Now, the multiplication sign that you see in the middle of this circle indicates that you need both of these things together in order to produce a crisis. You need the stresses, the slow processes, and you need the trigger simultaneously to produce a crisis. So you can think of that multiplication sign as a Boolean AND operator, for those of you who are familiar with Boolean logic. So you need stresses and triggers. They're both necessary conditions to produce a crisis. And a crisis, in turn, we have a fairly specific definition. This is a period of systemic instability. This is a period when the system is no longer in a predictable state, and you're not sure really where it's going to go. So one way we think about these things in complex systems science is in terms of what's called a stability landscape or an energy landscape. Think of a ball that represents the state of this particular system, the climate, the economy, the geopolitical system. The ball is going to want to reside at the bottom of one of these dips, which in complexity science are called basins of attraction. These are places where the system wants to stay, because there are various mechanisms that keep it stable, what complexity scientists would call homeostatic mechanisms. You think of the ways that the various biological and biochemical mechanisms and physiological mechanisms that keep our bodies at a constant temperature all the time. Those are homeostatic mechanisms. They create a basin of attraction for our bodies to have constant temperature. And that's where the system stays under ideal circumstances. So what stresses do over time is that they reduce the resilience of this basin of attraction. They make it more shallow, which means it's more likely that smaller and smaller triggers of various types are able to knock the system from this stability zone, from this equilibrium, into a state of crisis. And you notice that the state of crisis is between two basins, two bowls, because it indicates that the system actually isn't stable. It's in a situation where it could roll back to its previous circumstances, or it could roll forward into another basin of attraction, another equilibrium, which may be bad for us, or it could be perhaps better for us. But at the moment, during a period of crisis, there's a great deal of uncertainty. So the key thing here is that stresses reduce the resilience of the system by making this basin of attraction, by making the stability zone shallower in ways that make it easier for a particular trigger event to knock it into a situation of crisis. We find this distinction between stress, trigger, and crisis in our STC model to be particularly helpful in unpacking the underlying causal mechanisms. So I've mentioned the stresses, and I've said that these are generally global phenomena that operate over extended periods of time and are relatively predictable. What kinds of things are we talking about? Well, here is a list that we use within the Cascade Institute. We are in the process of refining this list now. We're engaging in what we call a global stress analysis. But when you look at this list, you will recognize pretty well all of them. These are things that we all understand are happening in the world. They're well documented. They are to some extent discrete and isolated from each other in the sense that they're causally separate. But we also know that they're related in important causal ways, that, for instance, climate heating is contributing to biodiversity loss. And climate heating is also contributing to the more rapid emergence of zoonotic viral diseases. You'll notice in this stress list that it moves from natural categories or phenomena at the top down towards social stresses, ones that manifest themselves largely within societies, towards the bottom. The last one, great power hegemonic transition, it refers to the change in the balance of power between the United States and China in particular, which international relations theorists would say is a moment of enormous danger for the global geopolitical system. I'm not going to go through all of these stresses today in detail. If I have had longer, I would speak about each of them individually, but I will highlight a couple of importance. I want to note the particular character of numbers 5 and 7. 5, high uniformity and connectivity of the global food supply, and 7, high uniformity and connectivity of the global financial system. Notice that there are two qualifiers or adjectives in both cases: high uniformity, high connectivity, high uniformity, high connectivity. Complexity scientists have found that whenever you have a system with high levels of both connectivity between the units in the system and uniformity across those, or homogeneity across those units, you have a system that's much more likely to experience cascading failure. So think of a monocrop, such as a field of corn, the crop corn, where you have the corn stalks or the corn plants planted very closely together in this large field, and they're all genetically identical because it's a monocrop. If a pathogen, a disease, or a blight affects one side of the field, it's going to spread very quickly across the entire crop, across the entire plantation of corn. Because those stalks are highly connected together, those plants are close together, so there's high connectivity, and because there's no genetic diversity in the crop. So there's an example of the negative consequences of the combination of high uniformity and connectivity. It turns out, when you look around the world, that humankind has created many systems that exhibit both high uniformity and high connectivity. And we've highlighted two here: the global food supply, where the germplasm, the genetic stock of our global food supply, for instance, when it comes to our core grains, upon which much of humanity depends. There's a relatively small number of grains. There's not a huge amount of genetic diversity in those grains. So there's much greater vulnerability of the global food supply to, for instance, the impact of pathogens or the impact of climate change. We also find the same kind of high uniformity and connectivity in the global financial system, where instruments that are used to trade within that financial system, for instance, derivatives, are often very similar, and that increases the likelihood of cascading failure in the global financial system because of when a financial crisis occurs in one part, that it's going to spread to much of the rest of the system. I said I'd highlight a couple of these stresses. One that we believe within the Cascade Institute is particularly important is the slowing economic growth that is increasingly evident around the world. If you look at the rate of economic growth, or the rate of increase in real per capita income in high income countries going back the last 60 years, you see a steady decline in real per capita income over that period. Now, this is, you'll note at the bottom of this diagram, there's some text indicating that we have removed from this time series those periods of time when the global financial system, or excuse me, the global economy was being severely impacted by what we would call exogenous shocks. In other words, shocks coming from the outside. So, for instance, the oil shocks of the 1970s have been removed, as has the pandemic more recently, because those were introducing noise into the underlying trend. And the underlying trend is very significant. We've seen a decline in per capita, real per capita economic growth on an annual basis from somewhat over 4% to under 2%. If there were one factor that if I had to point to one factor that is driving the rise of populist authoritarianism in wealthy countries in Europe and in North America, I would say that this decline in per capita economic growth is probably the most powerful factor. Global stresses, we argue, are amplifying, accelerating, and synchronizing. And I'm going to unpack each one of these ideas just very briefly now. Starting with amplification and acceleration, and I'll turn to my second example, which is global heating. This is a chart produced by James Hansen, who is formerly the senior climate scientist at NASA in the United States. This is his projection of what he expects to see in terms of accelerating warming in the future. But I want to distinguish between amplification and acceleration using this example of climate heating. The climate warming or climate heating has amplified in the sense that it's gotten worse. Around the turn of the century, the tropospheric temperature of the planet was around 0.72 degrees higher than it was during pre-industrial periods in the 19th century. Now we're at least 1.3 degrees warmer than pre-industrial temperatures, and may well be about to cross the 1.5 degree threshold. It looks like 2024 will probably be the first year where we've crossed the 1.5 degree threshold. So the problem is worse than it was. but it's also accelerating in the sense that warming is happening faster as we go into the future. So for instance, between 1970 and 2010, we saw warming of around 0.18 degrees per decade. Between 2010 and 2040, it's estimated that warming will increase to around 0.3 degrees per decade, maybe even 0.35 degrees per decade. So we've seen almost a doubling of the rate of warming, which, if you're familiar with statistics, means that the second derivative is increasing. The rate of warming is increasing. And that's what we mean by acceleration. And the result of this increased rate of warming is that we're packing much more energy into the hydrologic system on the planet. That's the cycle of water between the surface of the Earth and the atmosphere. And that means that the hydrologic system is becoming more vigorous. It's becoming more energetic, which means we see more severe droughts, much more substantial storms. It's as if we've created a large beast, a leviathan or a behemoth that is rampaging across the surface of the planet. And with every year, as the atmosphere gets warmer, we're pumping more and more energy into that beast, and it's doing more and more damage. If we don't deal with the underlying stress of increased carbon emissions that are changing the opaqueness of our atmosphere to infrared radiation, then we are not going to avoid polycrises that are contributed to by climate heating. So one way of thinking about amplification and acceleration is in terms of this waveform diagram. And this credit Mike Lawrence with coming up with this idea, which we found very helpful. You can think of over time, the crises are becoming larger in amplitude and increasingly crossing thresholds within our societies that we define as harm thresholds, at which point we call them crises. And also these crises are happening more frequently. So there's kind of increase in the frequency of the waveform, the compression of the waveform as we go to the right. If you look across the bottom, you see the list of the World Health Organization's major zoonotic viral disease outbreaks. And you do get the impression when you look at that list that there has been a compression over time in the sense that there's an increasing frequency. The period of time between outbreaks has declined from HIV in 1980, the next one being SARS in 2002. And then most recently, in fact, I haven't updated this slide, but now we're starting to see the outbreaks of H5N1 around the world. But you see that there seems to be a sense that zoonotic viral disease outbreaks are becoming more frequent, and they're having much more significant impacts, as we saw, for instance, with COVID-19. We also argue that these global stresses and the crises they cause are synchronizing. And I want to explain a little bit about what we mean by synchronizing by looking at two systems in parallel and how they might have interacted in the past. So by synchronization, we mean that there are feedback loops, what we would call positive feedback loops, in other words, self-reinforcing feedback loops between systems that cause them to develop crises more or less simultaneously. So let's look at an example here, starting with one system, which we will call the human viral ecological system. We have a stress at the top, which, excuse me a moment, I have a little problem with this. So the stress is increased connectivity between human communities, increased exchange of material and transport, travel between human communities. And then a trigger is a viral escape from a lab. And it appears that the COVID-19 pandemic was probably a result, ultimately, of a viral escape from a lab in Wuhan, China. So you take these two things together. Now, of course, many other things were required to contribute to the COVID-19 pandemic, but for sake of illustration, we're just highlighting these two, and they induce a pandemic. Simultaneously, we look at healthcare, the healthcare system, which in many parts of the world was experiencing at the same time chronic healthcare underfunding. The pandemic, as we know, in many parts of the world contributed to healthcare worker burnout. The combination of the stress in the healthcare system of chronic healthcare underfunding and healthcare worker burnout produced in many countries a systemic healthcare crisis. And then that systemic healthcare crisis, of course, undermined the capacity to deal with the pandemic and made the pandemic worse. So here we see, again, what we would call a positive or a self-reinforcing feedback, where a crisis in one system helped induce a trigger in another system that produced a crisis that then reinforced the crisis in the first system. And this kind of connectivity between systems, we believe, is driving much of the synchronization of crises, producing the entanglement that we now call a polycrisis. So let me give you another example at the global level of some of these feedback loops that might be inducing simultaneity among crises when we look at the world today and then look out in coming decades. This is a causal feedback set of causal feedback diagrams that we used within our article with the Cambridge Journal, Global Sustainability. Start with a relatively simple feedback loop between the stress of economic turmoil and scarcity, which induces the rise of populist authoritarian regimes, reinforcing nationalist anti-globalization ideology. You can see a reciprocal relationship between populist authoritarian regimes and the strengthening of anti-globalization nationalist ideology. And that ideology, in turn, undermines economic growth in a whole variety of ways, for instance, by encouraging regimes to impose tariffs, as we see in the United States. So you have a self-reinforcing cycle here. The nationalist anti-globalization ideology then can, along with the rise of populist authoritarian regimes, can both contribute to the decline of international cooperation. And that, to the extent that it interferes, for instance, with trade relations, can further induce economic turmoil and scarcity. So yet another feedback loop that is contributing to causal entanglement and broadening the polycrisis. That economic turmoil and scarcity can then help induce mass migration. And migrations, as we know, when they cross international borders, often induce political and social reactions in the receiving countries that inflames nationalist, chauvinistic ideology. So we can see yet another feedback loop. Over the longer period of time, the decline in international cooperation, to the extent that it weakens the international climate regime, can induce extreme weather, can contribute to the rising incidence of extreme weather events, which in turn would further drive mass migration. This is now looking out over a period of perhaps a decade or more. So here are a set of feedback loops that we believe defines a good deal of what we're seeing currently in the global polycrisis, and explains the kind of synchronization we're seeing between crises around the world. So I was asked by Tamsin to distinguish a little bit from this concept, distinguish this concept of polycrisis from some of the other terminology that you use within your day-to-day work: multiple simultaneous disasters, cascading emergencies, and complex emergencies. all of these concepts and all of this terminology is useful. They're all useful, but there are some important distinctions. Multiple simultaneous disasters really emphasizes events that are punctuated in time and space, and their simultaneity may just be a coincidence. Polycrisis is an extended period of systemic disequilibrium, and there is a distinct and identifiable set of relationships, causal relationships, that are causing the simultaneity to occur. In other words, these things are connected together. Cascading emergencies, that really is capturing this idea that I talked about when I was talking about dominoes falling over. Like, you get a series of effects that happen in time as you have a crisis causing other crises with what we would call knock-on effects. And those are very important phenomena. The knock-on effects need to be identified. But the polycrisis concept really highlights the importance of these self-reinforcing feedback loops that occur across multiple systems, as I just identified in those previous diagrams, something that's not so well captured by the concept of cascading emergencies. We believe that the complex emergencies concept, as for instance explained and elaborated by the Strauss Center, is perhaps the concept that's most similar to the notion of polycrisis. But the complex emergencies concept puts more emphasis on the presence of conflict, violent conflict, than the polycrisis concept does. So just to conclude my presentation today, I'm just going to introduce you to our most recent example of the application of some of our analytical methods to identify some of the connections between systems that I've been highlighting in my presentation to this point. And in particular, I'm going to talk about the election of Donald Trump in the United States. We produced this report, Impact 2024. It was released originally on October 3rd, updated on October 29th. And we were seeking to identify in an analytically very precise way how Donald Trump's reelection could amplify and synchronize global intersystemic risk. And I'll just show you quickly how we went about doing this in a way that was transparent and we hope accessible to a broad range of people working, for instance, in the investment community and policymaking communities around the world. And I think we all understand that Donald Trump's reelection is going to have impacts that will be immediately felt within the United States, but are going to have enormous consequences around the world for probably ultimately every person on this planet, and for all of the work we're doing in our diverse regions around the world. So first of all, let's start with what we would call the first and second order effects in the United States of Trump's election. We engaged in what we call a causal juncture analysis, a critical juncture analysis, as you see at the bottom there. And we identified a number of specific things that the Trump administration might do, and then possible causal pathways from that event. So the whole thing is what we would call a critical juncture. And then we identified in very rough terms what we regarded as the likelihood of those particular outcomes. So here we have on the left-hand side, the Trump administration implementing radical policy proposals such as deportation of millions of illegal immigrants from the country. And we believe that that action is likely to stimulate significant protest within the country from groups that are affected and from groups that are aligned with those who are affected. That protest may be contained either because it doesn't get too violent, or through the use of force, significant force by security services mobilized by the Trump administration, perhaps through a declaration of national emergency, or the invocation of the Insurgencies Act. So the Trump administration, another possible critical juncture is the Trump administration implementation of specific, excuse me, I missed something there, the invocation of the Insurrection Act, the 1807 Insurrection Act. The second possible critical juncture is the Trump administration's implementation of trade policies that are extremely restrictive. For instance, the tariff measures. We identify three possible outcomes: very restrictive tariff measures, which we call economic walls; less restrictive economic nationalism; and then some form of continuation of existing Biden administration policy. We regard the first two possibilities as being most likely, as you can see here. Here is the Trump administration implementing, for instance, mass deportations. And we regard as most probable here what we would call gradual mass expulsion rather than a rapid expulsion of millions of immigrants, but it was something that will take place over a period of years. So again, with each one of these critical junctures, we're able to identify possible pathways into the future and the probabilities associated with those pathways. And then finally, in this set of slides, the example of the Trump administration implementing transactional isolationist foreign policy. So this is foreign policy where Trump is significantly withdrawing from multilateral fora, from the United Nations, from the Paris Accords, from basically the panoply of regimes in the world that create the rules-based order at the global level. And it could have multiple effects. It could increase the risk of a self-help world, which international relations theorists would call anarchic. It could provide openings for Chinese global leadership, or it could lead to many nations and organizations stepping in, like IFRC stepping in to fill the gap under a complex global governance regime. So those are the first and second order effects, but then we also analyze the feedback loops that might result from some of these first and second order effects in the United States. These are feedback loops happening at the global level. For instance, American tariffs could produce a trade war between the United States in particular and China. That seems very likely to happen now, which ultimately could engender global inflation, reduce global economic growth, and have broad economic impacts for the whole planet. The development of authoritarian practices in the United States could have multiple implications within the United States in terms of declining trust in public institutions, broad public acceptance of extraordinary measures, and the increase in corruption and abuses of power in the United States, all of which could have a contagion effect and encourage authoritarian regimes elsewhere in the world. And some of those authoritarian regimes might actually become models for increased authoritarianism in the United States. And then finally, the withdrawal of the United States from multilateral fora and from international security institutions, the weakening, for instance, of the commitment to NATO, could increase aggression by US competitors around the world, which would induce greater military spending by American allies because they can no longer rely upon American protection, which would induce arms races between America's rivals and America's allies. And I think, again, we're starting to see this develop in Europe. All of these loops together, we actually identified 8 possible feedback loops that could be induced by the Trump administration could all ultimately contribute to a worsening of the global polycrisis. I'm not going to go into detail about how this diagram works, but you can get a sense that some of the feedback loops that I was just highlighting, for instance, the increasing authoritarianism in the United States, the arms races that might develop, the international spread of authoritarianism, all of these feedback loops can interconnect in ways that ultimately severely aggravate over time the global polycrisis that we're already experiencing. This is not a happy story, as you can see, but it's one that is unfortunately part of our reality now. So just to conclude, let me say a few words about addressing the polycrisis. What do we do in these circumstances? There are really three things that I think we can highlight. First is the fundamental importance of trying to reduce the underlying stresses so that we can avoid or prevent polycrises. So this means that we need ultimately to be reducing as a species, for instance, our carbon emissions. It's fundamentally important that we deal with the underlying drivers of the stresses that are reducing the resilience of our systems and increasing the likelihood of crisis and entangled crises. In the absence of dealing with, for instance, drivers like rising carbon emissions, everything that we're doing is simply a Band-Aid solution. Secondly, given that polycrisis is occurring and that it will probably become worse in the future, we need to think about how we can limit the harm of the polycrisis by identifying connections and interdependencies between global systems that are causing crisis to spread. And in particular here, we need to be paying attention to those feedback loops and ways of trying to reduce the vigor or the harm that's induced by these positive feedback loops that are self-reinforcing. So the more that we understand some of those loops that I was identifying just recently, and the more that we can act to weaken them, the more we will reduce the harm induced by polycrisis. And then finally, we need to recognize that polycrises can actually create opportunities for positive change by weakening sclerotic or rigid forms of institutions and policies and practices that have long needed change, but where there hasn't been much incentive to induce the change in the past. And a good example would be, an opportunity that was missed was with the recent pandemic. We could have, during the pandemic and subsequent to the pandemic, put in place a global network of monitoring stations monitoring stations and mechanisms for tracking the change in the genetic nature of zoonotic viral diseases and outbreaks of zoonotic viral diseases around the world, and a distributed system for producing vaccines all over the planet in response to the evolution and emergence of new zoonotic viral diseases. We haven't done that, but there was an opportunity in the aftermath of the polycrisis to exploit that crisis in a way that could have ultimately made humankind much better off. So finally, I just want to highlight that if you are interested in more information, we have on our website, the Cascade Institute, an Introduction to Polycrisis Analysis, which is an accessible survey that provides somewhat more detail on the ideas I introduced in this talk. And also you can go to polycrisis.org, which is a website that is regularly updated, that provides you with a full repertoire of information, a resource library, and a learning journey, which is basically a series of questions that that are commonly asked about the polycrisis and answers to those questions, as well as a map of people working and organizations working on polycrisis issues around the world. And all of that is easily available at polycrisis.org. And finally, we have produced a report, which we call our Positive Pathways report, that highlights some of those positive possibilities that could emerge from polycrisis that I was talking about a moment ago, and circumstances in which we can take advantage or exploit the disruption of polycrisis in order to change things in more positive ways. And thank you very much. And I look forward to our conversation.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Tad. And thank you for taking us through like a very, very big journey in less than an hour. I'm sure that there will be comments and questions, but maybe I'll start out just saying why we thought this was so inspirational and why we thought we could make use of it. I think this, the last one about what can we avoid, how can we mitigate and how can we navigate, I think that's those are all elements that are talking to us as Red Cross, and national societies play a really important role in country, and they have the opportunity both to do what we call humanitarian diplomacy, but advocate with their governments, and actors that are present in country, and have meaningful dialogues and also push and guide to certain directions, and also maybe more operationally through the presence both at national level and as I also said in the beginning, at very local level. We have this opportunity, I would say, both to help navigate, but also to sometimes mitigate in terms of the areas that we are working in, which is very much resonating with the migration, with health, climate crisis increasingly. So we have a lot of really important power locally that could be activated, that activated in the right way could really make a positive difference. So from my end, I think national societies have an enormous possibility and potential in with a better understanding of these dots connected and the self-reinforcing feedback loops. I think that's something that really resonates with us, could really be helping in understanding better the world as it is today, but also be a stronger dialogue partner to governments at local level, but also at national level. And then from the IFRC side, we would be really happy to connect all this, to take it also to at least a regional level for now, but also potentially to more global.